The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the classroom, painting faint golden lines across the wooden desks. The chatter of children filled the air, the sound of pens tapping and chairs scraping echoing like a familiar rhythm. For most students, it was just another day of school. For Daniel, it was another chance to prove to himself that he belonged. Even though deep inside, he often felt like he did not. Daniel was 12 years old, the son of a hard-working farmer. His family's farm sat on the edge of town, where the soil was rich, but life was never easy. His father rose before dawn every morning to tend to the fields. His mother cared for the home and animals, and his grandfather, though older and slower now, still the source of wisdom in their household. They did not have much money, but they had pride and dignity. And for Daniel, his greatest dream was to rise beyond the farm. To show that a boy like him could hold his own in the world of knowledge, but in the classroom, that dream often felt out of reach. His teacher, Mrs. Wallace, was a sharp woman with silver hair that framed her face in perfect lines. She carried herself with an air of superiority, and though she claimed to teach with fairness, her actions betrayed something else. She treated Daniel differently. Whenever he raised his hand, she sighed. Whenever he stumbled on an answer, she smirked. And whenever the class needed an example of failure, she seemed to find it in him. That morning, the lesson was about history. The children sat upright, their notebooks open. Mrs. Wallace wrote dates and names across the board with quick, precise strokes. "Who can tell me what year the Declaration of Independence was signed?" she asked, her eyes scanning the room. Several hands shot up immediately. Daniel hesitated, remembering the page he had studied the night before. He whispered the answer to himself. 1776, and slowly lifted his hand. Mrs. Wallace's eyes landed on him. A small smile curled on her lips, but it was not kind. "Yes, Daniel," she said, her voice laced with mock sweetness. "Let us see if you know this one." Daniel's heart thumped as the room grew quieter. He opened his mouth and spoke. 1776, ma'am." For a second, silence lingered. He felt proud, certain he had answered correctly. But then, Mrs. Wallace's voice rang out sharp and cutting. "Oh, finally you remembered something," she said, her words dripping with sarcasm. "I was worried your little farm brain had no space for history." The class chuckled nervously. Daniel's cheeks burned. He wanted to shrink into his chair, to disappear completely. Mrs. Wallace was not finished. She walked closer, her heels clicking against the floor, her finger pointed like a weapon. "But tell me, Daniel, can you even explain what the Declaration of Independence means? Or do you just memorize words without understanding?" Daniel's mouth opened, but the words caught in his throat. He knew something, but under her piercing stare, his thoughts scattered like frightened birds. He stuttered it. "It means..." Mrs. Wallace's voice thundered. "It means you do not know. You are too dumb to understand, Daniel. Maybe you should stick to planting potatoes with your father instead of wasting our time here." The words fell heavy across the room. A few students gasped. Others looked down at their desks, ashamed for him. Daniel's heart cracked. He felt the sting of humiliation in front of everyone, a wound deeper than any physical pain. He lowered his head, trying to blink back the tears that threatened to spill. But Mrs. Wallace had already turned back to the board, beseeching him with a wave of her hand as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience. The rest of the lesson passed in a blur. Daniel heard little of what was said. His mind kept replaying the teacher's words to dumb, stick to planting potatoes. The sound of laughter, even if it was not directed at him, seemed louder in his ears. He sat motionless, his pencil frozen on his notebook, his spirit crushed. When the bell rang, the children gathered their books and rushed out. Daniel stayed behind, his legs heavy, his eyes fixed on the desk. He felt smaller than ever, like a shadow in a world that had no place for him. As he walked home, each step seemed harder than the last. The dirt road stretched long and lonely, the fields on either side whispering with the wind. He thought of his father's calloused hands, his mother's gentle smile, and his grandfather's strong voice. They all believed in him. But how could he believe in himself when even his teacher said he was worthless? By the time he reached the farmhouse, The sun had dipped lower, casting orange light across the barn. His mother was on the porch, peeling vegetables. She looked up and immediately saw the sadness in his face. "What happened, Daniel?" she asked softly, setting aside her work. Daniel dropped his bag and sat beside her. His voice trembled as he told her everything: how Mrs. Wallace had called him dumb, how the class had laughed, how helpless he had felt. His mother listened, her eyes growing moist with sorrow. His father soon joined them, wiping sweat from his brow after a long day in the fields. When he heard the story, his jaw tightened, his fists clenched. "No one should speak to my son like that," he said, his voice heavy with anger. "Especially not a teacher." But before he could say more, the door creaked open, and Daniel's grandfather stepped out. The old man's hair was white, his back slightly bent, but his presence carried weight. He looked at Daniel with eyes that had seen hardship and triumph alike. "Come here, boy," the grandfather said, his voice calm but firm. Daniel walked over, and his grandfather placed a weathered hand on his shoulder. "Do not let her words break you," he said. "They call you dumb because they fear the strength you carry inside. Remember, the seeds are buried deep in the soil, and people may forget them. But one day they rise, tall and unshakable." Daniel blinked, trying to understand. His grandfather smiled gently. "You are that seed. Let the world bury you with insults, but do not let them kill your spirit. You will rise, boy. You will rise." The family sat together as the evening shadows lengthened. Daniel still felt the sting of humiliation. But his grandfather's words planted something new inside him. Quiet strength. A hope that maybe he was more than what the teacher saw that night. As he lay in bed, he stared at the ceiling, hearing his grandfather's voice again and again. "You will rise." The pain had not disappeared, but for the first time, he believed it might one day turn into something greater, and so began a story that would shake not only Daniel's life, but the entire school. Asterisk. The dirt road stretched under Daniel's feet as he made his way home after the long day at school. And with every step, the heavy words of his teacher echoed louder in his mind. The voices of his classmates had faded, the sound of laughter and whispering no longer around him. But the memory of it all burned deeper than any bruise could. The boy carried not just his school bag on his shoulder, but also a weight that seemed too heavy for someone his age. He walked slowly, kicking at the stones on the road, wishing the earth could open up and swallow him so he would not have to face anyone. When Daniel reached the small farmhouse, the familiar smell of food cooking drifted through the air. Normally, that smell filled him with comfort, a reminder of the warmth and love inside, but today his heart was not ready to feel comforted. He opened the wooden door and saw his mother working in the kitchen. She turned to greet him with a smile, but the smile faded quickly when she noticed his eyes cast down and his shoulders slumped. A mother knows the language of her child's silence. She could see something was wrong before he even spoke. "Daniel, what happened?" she asked gently, putting down the pot she was holding. He dropped his bag to the floor and sat on the chair by the table. At first, he did not want to speak, afraid his voice would break, but her gaze urged him on. Finally, in a voice heavy with hurt, explained how Mrs. Wallace had called him dumb in front of everyone, how she mocked him for being the farmer's boy, how the class had laughed. As the words left his lips, he felt the sting all over again, and tears pressed against his eyes, though he tried to blink them away. His mother's face grew sad as she listened, her hands reaching out to hold his. "My son," she whispered, "no one has the right to call you that. You are not dumb. You are my bright boy, and I know your worth." Her voice was soft, but it carried the strength of a mother's love, a shield against the cruelty of the world. Just then, the door creaked open, and Daniel's father walked in from the fields. His shirt was stained with dirt, and sweat dripped from his brow. But when he saw the sorrow on his son's face, he stopped in his tracks. "What happened here?" he asked firmly, Daniel's mother explained, her voice shaking with both anger and sadness, and the father's jaw tightened as he listened. He was a man who had worked all his life in the soil, who had endured the sun's heat and the cold winds, who had never bent his back for anyone but the earth. Hearing that someone had insulted his boy, not for his mistakes, but for who he was, lit a fire in his chest. He slammed his rough hands on the table and said, "No one, not even a teacher, has the right to speak to my son that way. If she thinks the work of a farmer is low, she should remember it is the farmer who grows the food she eats." His voice trembled with pride, his anger sharp but rooted in love. Daniel looked at his father, both comforted and frightened by his strong words. Part of him wanted his father to march to the school and demand respect, but another part of him feared the attention it would bring. The boy wanted to be seen for who he was, not pitied or defended like someone too weak to stand on his own. Before anyone else spoke, another voice filled the room. It was deep and steady, worn with age but powerful enough to silence the storm. From the corner of the room, Daniel's grandfather emerged, leaning slightly on his cane. His hair was white, his skin lined with years of labor, but his eyes carried wisdom that had guided the family through decades of hardship. He looked at his grandson with a calm that soothed the tension in the room. "Come here, boy," the old man said, gesturing with his hand. Daniel rose slowly and stood before him. The grandfather placed his calloused palm on the boy's shoulder and studied him for a long moment. "Do you know what happens to a seed when it is planted?" he asked softly. Daniel frowned, not sure why his grandfather was asking. "It gets buried," he replied. "Yes," the grandfather said with a nod. "It gets buried in the dark soil, pressed down where no one can see it. Some people think that is the end of it, but what they forget is that under the soil, the seed is growing. It gathers strength, it pushes against the darkness, and one day it breaks through the ground to reach the sky. That is you, Daniel. They may try to bury you with insults, they may laugh and call you dumb, but they cannot stop what is inside you from rising." The boy's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were not only from pain. Something stirred in his chest, a flicker of hope sparked by the words of the man who had seen life from every side. His grandfather squeezed his shoulder gently. "Your teacher's words are heavy, but remember they belong to her, not to you. Do not carry them as if they are true. Carry your own truth, boy. You are not dumb. You are not small. You are a seed, and one day you will rise so high that even those who mocked you will look up in silence." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. His father, who had been pacing angrily, softened as he heard his father's wisdom. His mother wiped her eyes and smiled through her tears, grateful that her son had someone to remind him of his worth. The night grew darker outside, the stars beginning to shine in the wide country sky. The family sat together at the table, the meal untouched for a while, as they shared not food but words of strength. Daniel felt the sting of humiliation still, but beneath it now was something stronger. His grandfather's words planted themselves deep inside him, like the very seeds the old man had spoken of. Later, when Daniel lay in bed, he stared at the ceiling and repeated those words over and over. "You are a seed. You will rise." He thought of the soil outside, of how every crop on their farm began hidden, unseen, how patience and faith turned tiny seeds into fields of life. He wondered if maybe his life was the same that the dark. Moments were not the end, but the beginning of something greater. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it carried with it the first traces of belief. Daniel knew the days ahead would not be easy. His teacher would still look down on him, the students might still laugh, and the road would still be long. But he also knew something else now. He was not alone, and he was not what they called him. What Daniel did not know, as he drifted into sleep, was that his grandfather's quiet wisdom was only part of the strength he carried. The old man held secrets of his own, stories of resilience and triumph that the boy had never heard. And soon those stories would shake not just his family, but the entire school. The pain he felt today was only the first step on a path that would lead to a moment no one could have imagined. And so the night closed on the farmhouse, the stars watching silently above, as a boy's sorrow slowly began to transform into the seed of strength that would one day rise above humiliation. Asterisk. The following morning, Daniel woke to the sound of roosters calling outside and the smell of fresh bread drifting through the house. For a moment, the warmth of home shielded him from the cold sting of the classroom memory. But as soon as he sat up in bed, The words of his teacher returned to his mind like heavy stones. He could still hear her voice, sharp and cutting, declaring him too dumb to understand. And he could still feel the laughter of his classmates pressing against him like a shadow that would not leave. He sighed and rubbed his eyes, wishing the day would not come. But he knew the sun was already climbing high, and he could not hide forever. He dressed slowly, tying the knot of his tie with hands that trembled with doubt, and he moved toward the kitchen. His mother greeted him with a soft smile, though she could see his spirit still weighed down. His father sat at the table drinking his coffee, his eyes filled with thought as if planning 100 battles in his mind. But it was his grandfather, sitting in his usual chair by the window, who called Daniel over with a single nod of his head. "Come sit with me, boy," the old man said, his voice steady and strong despite his years. Daniel obeyed, lowering himself into the chair beside him. The morning sun touched the old man's silver hair, and his weathered face looked as though it carried the stories of centuries. "I have watched you carry yesterday's pain on your shoulders," the grandfather said quietly, his eyes never leaving the boy's face. "And I see that you still do not believe what I told you about being a seed. So today I will tell you something I have kept to myself for many years. You are old enough now to hear it. It may help you understand who you are." Daniel looked up, his curiosity fighting through his sadness. His grandfather had always been a man of wisdom, but he rarely spoke about his past. The boy leaned closer, ready to listen. "When I was your age," the grandfather began, "people thought little of me too. They said I was poor, uneducated, and destined to stay in the dirt. They laughed at my hands because they were rough from work, and they mocked me for dreaming of things they thought were beyond me. But I learned quickly that the world does not hand respect to you. You must take it with your actions, with your courage, and with the choices you make when no one believes in you." Daniel listened closely, his heart pounding. The old man's voice was calm. Beneath it was a fire that burned brighter with each word. "I worked the fields by day, and at night I studied by the light of a single lamp. I read books that others had thrown away. I taught myself numbers. I studied machines, and I asked questions no one bothered to ask. And slowly, piece by piece, I built a life they never expected from me. I started a small business fixing broken tools, then tractors, then even larger machines. I saved every coin, and with time, I grew something that gave me more than survival. It gave me freedom. And do you know why I succeeded, Daniel? Because I never believed the lies they told me about myself. I was not dumb. I was not weak. I was not small. I was simply waiting for my time to rise." The boy's eyes widened. He had always known his grandfather as a farmer, as a man of the land, but he had never heard of these things before. "Grandpa," he whispered, "you've never told us this." The old man chuckled softly. "I did not need to. It was enough for me to know, and I wanted to live quietly, raising my family and working the soil. But now I see that you need to hear it because you are walking the same path I once walked. They may try to bury you, but you will rise higher than they ever dreamed." Daniel felt a strange mix of awe and hope, but also confusion. If his grandfather had built all of this, if he had succeeded beyond the farm, why had no one in town spoken of it? Why did the teacher still treat their family with such disdain? The old man's eyes twinkled, as if reading his thoughts. "People only see what they want to see, Daniel. Some will never see your worth, no matter how brightly you shine. That is their blindness, not your failure. But soon, very soon, the world around you will see. Not because you shout or demand it, but because your strength will be impossible to ignore." Daniel swallowed hard. The words wrapped around his heart like a blanket, warming him against the cold of humiliation. For the first time, he imagined himself not as the weak boy in the classroom, but as something more. Someone capable of proving them wrong. "Grandpa," he said softly, "do you really think I can rise like you did?" The old man smiled and patted his shoulder. "I do not think it, boy. I know it. You have my blood in your veins, the same fire in your chest. And when the time comes, you will rise so high that even those who mocked you will stand in silence." As the day stretched on, Daniel carried those words with him like a shield. The fear of returning to school still gnawed at him, but but now there was also a seed of determination planted deep inside. His grandfather's story gave him strength, and though he could not yet imagine what would happen next, he felt for the first time that maybe the world had more waiting for him than humiliation. That night, long after dinner had ended and the house was quiet, Daniel lay in bed, thinking of his grandfather's secret. He imagined the old man as a boy like himself, mocked and underestimated, yet pushing forward against all odds. He pictured the machines his grandfather had fixed, the coins he had saved, the business he had grown in silence. And then he imagined himself walking that same path, rising higher than his teacher could ever believe. Outside, the wind whispered through the fields, carrying with it the promise of change. Daniel did not know it yet, but the next day would bring something so unexpected, so powerful, that it would shake not only the walls of his classroom, but the entire school. His grandfather had been right. Seeds grow quietly beneath the soil until the day they break through. And Daniel's day was coming faster than anyone could have guessed. The morning sun rose slowly over the fields, turning the sky into shades of gold and pink. Birds sang from the trees, and the cool air carried the smell of fresh soil and grass. Daniel woke up earlier than usual, his heart already restless as he thought about facing his classmates and his teacher again. The memory of humiliation was still sharp inside him, but the words of his grandfather echoed louder, filling him with something new. "You are a seed," the old man had said, "and one day you will rise." That thought was the first thing on Daniel's mind as he sat on the edge of his bed, pulling on his school uniform with hands that trembled less than they had the day before. At the breakfast table, his mother placed food in front of him and brushed his hair gently, noticing the determination in his eyes. She smiled, proud of the quiet courage she saw forming in her son. His father nodded at him with approval, while his grandfather, seated in his usual spot by the window, simply watched. The old man did not need to speak. His eyes told Daniel everything. Walk into that classroom today with your head high, no matter what they say. The walk to school felt different that morning. The dirt road was the same, lined with tall grass and the occasional bird flying overhead, but Daniel's steps were quicker. He no longer dragged his feet like a boy beaten down. He walked like someone carrying a secret strength inside, something no insult could erase. When he entered the classroom, the air felt heavy with the chatter of students. Some glanced at him and whispered, remembering the humiliation from the day before. A few smirked, but others looked curious, sensing something had changed in him. Daniel took his seat quietly, placing his books on the desk, and looked straight ahead. Mrs. Wallace, the teacher, swept into the room with her usual sharpness. She wore a neat suit and carried her books in a way that demanded attention. Her eyes scanned the students, and when they landed on Daniel, a faint smirk touched her lips. She remembered the way he had stammered the day before, how easy it had been to turn him into an example of failure. She had no idea that her cruelty had planted the very seed that was beginning to grow in him. The lesson began, and Mrs. Wallace wrote questions on the board, turning to the class with her piercing gaze. "Who can explain what the word liberty means?" she asked, her tone carrying both challenge and expectation. Several hands shot up immediately. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He knew the answer, but fear still lurked at the edges of his mind. Then he remembered his grandfather's voice, steady and sure, telling him that he must carry his own truth. Slowly, he raised his hand. The teacher's eyes narrowed. Well, Daniel," she said mockingly. "You think you know this one? Let us hear it then." Daniel stood up, his legs shaking slightly, but his voice carried more steadiness than before. "Liberty means freedom," he said. "It means having the right to make choices, to live without being controlled unfairly." For a moment, the room was silent. The students looked at him with surprise. His answer was clear, simple, and correct. Mrs. Wallace's smirk faded into a thin line, but she refused to give him satisfaction. "Barely acceptable," she said coldly. "Do not get too proud, boy." But Daniel did not sit down feeling ashamed as he had before. He sat down with his heart beating fast, proud that he had spoken with confidence. He knew the teacher would not praise him, but the silence in the room told him something more important. His classmates had seen his strength. The rest of the lesson carried on, but Daniel noticed something different. Whenever the teacher asked questions, he listened closely, ready to answer. Even when she dismissed him with sharp words, he no longer felt small. Each insult was like another layer of soil pressing over him, but inside he could feel himself pushing against it. Ready to grow, by the time the final bell rang, Daniel felt lighter. He had not defeated his teacher's cruelty, but he had defeated the fear that had held him down. That was the real victory. He packed his books with care, and as he walked out of the classroom, he held his head higher than he had the day before. Outside, the sun was bright, and the chatter of students filled the air as they rushed home. Daniel walked slower, letting the warmth of the sun touch his face. He thought again of his grandfather, of the stories he had told, of the wisdom that had opened a new world inside him. He realized now that strength was not about shouting or fighting. It was about standing tall even when someone tried to push you down. It was about answering with courage even when fear wanted to silence you. When he reached home, his grandfather was waiting on the porch, leaning on his cane with his eyes fixed on the horizon. Daniel walked up to him and said proudly, "I answered a question today. She tried to put me down, but I spoke clearly. I was not afraid." The old man's eyes softened with pride, and he nodded slowly. "That is the first step, boy," he said. "You have shown yourself that you can rise. And once you rise once, you will rise again and again, till no one can bury you with their words." Daniel smiled for the first time in days. A genuine smile that carried both relief and hope. His mother, hearing the conversation, came out and hugged him tightly, while his father patted him on the shoulder with pride that evening. As the family ate together, the grandfather's words lingered in Daniel's heart. He felt stronger, steadier, and for the first time, he believed he had the power to shape his own path. But what he did not know was that the lesson he had learned today was only the beginning. The real test, and the moment that would change everything, was waiting for him just around the corner. The day of humiliation was already turning into a story of growth, and soon the world beyond his small classroom would see the truth his grandfather had always known. Seeds do not stay hidden forever. When the time comes, they rise, and their strength is undeniable. And in just a single day, Daniel's strength would be revealed in a way that would leave not just his teacher, but the entire school in stunned silence. Asterisk. The next day began like any other, but hidden beneath the ordinary rhythm of life, something extraordinary was waiting to unfold. The morning air was crisp, carrying with it the smell of dew and freshly turned soil from the nearby fields. Daniel woke earlier than usual, his mind already racing. He washed, dressed, and quietly prepared for school, still feeling the sting of his teacher's words in his memory, but also holding on to the strength his grandfather had planted in him. He was not the same boy he had been a few days ago. His steps now carried a trace of confidence, though it was still fragile, like a flame that could be extinguished by the first gust of wind. The family sat together at breakfast. His mother made sure his plate was full, urging him to eat, while his father spoke little, lost in thought as he drank his coffee. His grandfather, however, watched him carefully, as if weighing every movement, every glance. Finally, the old man leaned forward, his voice steady and low. "Today, Daniel, you will learn something that will stay with you for the rest of your life. You do not know it yet, but the world is about to see you differently." Daniel frowned, unsure of what his grandfather meant, but he trusted his words. The old man always seemed to know more than he let on. Daniel picked up his school bag and began the long walk to class, not realizing the day would become one of the most unforgettable moments in his life. When he entered the classroom, the same hum of chatter and laughter filled the air. Some students still remembered his humiliation and whispered among themselves, but others noticed the way he carried himself, now his back a little straighter, his eyes more focused. Mrs. Wallace, the teacher, swept into the room with her usual cold air of authority. She gave Daniel one quick glance and smirked, as though already preparing to cut him down again should he stumble. The lessons dragged on as the morning passed. Questions were asked, answers given, and Daniel found himself participating more than before. He did not always know everything, but he spoke with clarity, surprising even himself. Some of his classmates began to look at him differently, less as the farmer's boy they could laugh at, and more as someone who had found a voice. Still, Mrs. Wallace refused to acknowledge any progress. Each time he answered, she dismissed him with a sharp comment, unwilling to let go of her view of him. But fate had already chosen. Stay for something far greater than a classroom exchange, as the final bell of the day rang. Signaling the end of lessons, the students began to pack their bags. Excitement bubbled in the room as they prepared to rush outside and enjoy the freedom of the afternoon. Then, suddenly, a strange sound cut through the noise. At first, it was distant, like a faint thumping carried on the wind. But with each second, it grew louder, deeper, and more powerful. Until the very windows of the classroom began to rattle. The students froze, their chatter silenced by confusion. Mrs. Wallace frowned, looking toward the window, her expression tightening as the sound grew deafening. And then, all at once, the source revealed itself. A helicopter appeared in the sky, sleek and imposing, its blades slicing through the air with thunderous rhythm. The children gasped, some shouting with excitement, others covering their ears. The noise filled the entire schoolyard as the helicopter descended lower and lower, its shadow sweeping across the building. Dust swirled, grass bent flat beneath the force of its blades, and the roar of the machine drowned out every other sound. The pilot guided the aircraft with precision, bringing it down onto the open field just beyond the school grounds. Teachers rushed outside, stunned and bewildered. Students pressed against the windows, their faces wide with shock and awe. Helicopters were something they had only seen in movies or on the news. None of them had ever imagined one landing right at their school. As the blades slowed, the door of the helicopter opened, and out stepped Daniel's grandfather, the old man. Usually seen in worn clothes and boots covered with soil, now stood tall in a sharp suit, his posture straight and commanding. The sun caught the silver in his hair, and the expression on his face was calm but unshakable. He walked forward with the steady steps of someone who belonged in that moment, someone who carried a presence that could not be ignored. The entire schoolyard erupted with whispers. Who is that? Why is he here? He came in a helicopter. The students looked at one another, their eyes wide with disbelief. Teachers exchanged glances, unsure of what was happening. And Daniel, still standing by his desk, felt his chest tighten as realization dawned. His grandfather, the man who had spoken to him of seeds and strength, the man who had lived quietly on their farm, was the very person stepping out of that machine. Commanding the attention of everyone, Mrs. Wallace's face turned pale. She adjusted her glasses nervously, trying to maintain her authority, but even she could not disguise the shock in her eyes. She had no idea who Daniel's family truly was. The grandfather walked steadily toward the school building, his cane tapping lightly against the ground, though he hardly seemed to need it. Every eye followed him. He entered the hallway, his footsteps echoing, and soon he was standing in the doorway of Daniel's classroom. Silence fell instantly. The students sat frozen, their mouths open. Even Mrs. Wallace stood stiffly, unsure how to respond. The old man's eyes scanned the room before resting on Daniel. His face softened as he nodded at his grandson, then turned his gaze on the teacher. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of thunder. "I am here for my grandson," he said, "and I am here to remind this school of a lesson far greater than any found in books." Mrs. Wallace tried to speak, but her voice faltered. "Sir, this is highly irregular," but the grandfather raised his hand, silencing her without anger, only authority. "A teacher's duty is to lift her students, not to crush them. Yesterday, my grandson was humiliated in front of this class, not because he lacked intelligence, but because of prejudice and cruelty. That ends today." Gasps filled the room. Daniel's classmates stared at him in awe, realizing the truth of what had happened. The teacher's face flushed, her lips trembling as she tried to respond. But the weight of the moment pressed her down. The old man stepped closer, his voice firm and clear. "This boy is not dumb. He is not small. He is not to be dismissed because his family works the soil. That soil feeds the world. And one day, this boy will rise higher than any insult you can throw at him. If you cannot see that, then perhaps it is not him who has failed, but you." The silence that followed was heavy, unbreakable. Every student in the room stared, their respect for Daniel growing by the second. The teacher looked down, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Then, the grandfather turned back to Daniel, his face softening once more. "Come with me, boy," he said, extending his hand. Daniel stood slowly, his legs trembling not from fear, but from pride. He walked to his grandfather, who placed a hand on his shoulder. Together, they stepped out of the classroom and into the sunlight, where the helicopter still waited, shining like a symbol of everything Daniel's classmates had never expected from the farmer's boy. As the blades began to spin again, kicking up dust and wind, the students pressed against the windows, their faces lit with awe and disbelief. For the rest of their lives, they would remember the day when the boy they had once laughed walked out of school beside a man who had arrived in a helicopter. And for Daniel, that day marked the moment when the seed his grandfather had spoken of began to break through the soil. The lesson of strength had turned into something visible, undeniable, and unforgettable. Asterisk, the sound of the helicopter blades faded slowly into the distance, leaving behind an eerie silence that hung over the school like a heavy fog. Dust settled across the playground, and the whispers of astonishment rippled through every corner of the building. Students who had once mocked Daniel now sat stunned, unable to process the sight they had just witnessed. A boy they had dismissed as a farmer's son had walked out with his grandfather, a man who carried himself with the kind of power and dignity that few had ever seen. Even the older teachers stood frozen, their eyes wide and their mouths slightly open, struggling to understand the depth of what had just happened. But in that silence, one person felt the weight more than anyone else. Mrs. Wallace. She remained at the front of the classroom, gripping the edge of her desk so tightly her knuckles turned white. The mocking words she had thrown at Daniel only days ago echoed back to her now, but this time they did not sound triumphant. They sounded cruel, bitter, and shameful. Every student in that room had seen her tear down a child, and every student had now seen the truth that Daniel's family carried a strength far greater than she had ever imagined. When the class finally dispersed, the children poured into the hallways, buzzing with chatter about the helicopter, about Daniel's grandfather, about how everything they thought they knew had just been turned upside down. Some of them rushed outside to tell the story again and again, exaggerating details in their excitement, while others simply stood together, whispering in disbelief. The story spread through the school like fire. By the time the afternoon sun tilted across the sky, every student knew what had happened. Mrs. Wallace, however, walked slowly back to the teacher's lounge, her footsteps heavy. For the first time in many years, she felt something that her pride had always shielded her from: guilt. She sat down at a table, staring at her hands, replaying the moment when Daniel's grandfather had stood in the doorway, his presence silencing the room, his words piercing deeper than any insult she had ever given. She had thought herself powerful in the classroom, but compared to that man's dignity, her authority felt hollow. That evening, as she walked home, her thoughts refused to leave her. She passed familiar streets, nodded absently at neighbors, but inside her mind was a storm. Why had she been so harsh with Daniel? Was it because of his background? Because he came from a family of farmers? Was it because she had grown comfortable using him as an example of failure? The truth stung. She had allowed her prejudice to blind her. She had humiliated a child not to teach him, but to elevate herself. And now the entire school had seen her exposed for what she truly was. Meanwhile, Daniel returned home with his grandfather. His heart still pounded from the experience of walking out of the school beside him, from feeling the eyes of every student fixed upon him. When the helicopter lifted them into the air, Daniel had looked down at the shrinking schoolyard and felt something shift inside him. He was no longer just the boy who had been humiliated. He was the boy who had risen, the boy who carried his family's dignity with him like armor. His grandfather sat beside him, calm as always, as though the entire dramatic moment had been nothing more than another day. But Daniel knew it was not just another day. It was the day everything had changed at home. The family gathered in the living room, the quiet hum of the evening filling the space. His mother's eyes were full of pride, while his father sat straighter than usual, his chest swelling with the kind of pride that words could not capture. Daniel told them everything: the silence in the classroom, the look on his teacher's face, the whispers of his classmates. His grandfather listened quietly, then finally spoke. "Remember, Daniel," he said, "this is not about showing off wealth or power. It is about teaching respect. Some people will only learn when they are faced with the truth in a way they cannot ignore. But do not let this make you arrogant. True strength is not about making others feel small. It is about standing tall without stepping on anyone else." Daniel nodded, letting the words sink in. He understood. What had happened was not a moment of revenge, but a lesson for his teacher, for his classmates, and for himself. He felt lighter now, as if a heavy chain had been broken. But he also knew that the journey was not finished. The next morning, when he walked back into the school, the atmosphere was completely different. Students who once laughed at him now looked at him with curiosity, even admiration. Some whispered greetings as he passed, their eyes filled with respect that had not been there before. Daniel walked with quiet confidence, not boasting, not showing off, but simply carrying himself with dignity. When he entered the classroom, Mrs. Wallace was already there. She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. The smirk that had once played across her lips was gone. Instead, her face carried something else: hesitation, perhaps even regret. The class fell silent as she cleared her throat, adjusting the papers on her desk. Finally, in a voice softer than usual, she spoke. "Good morning, class. Let us begin." Throughout the lesson, she did not mock Daniel. She did not use him as an example. Instead, she called on other students, her tone more even, her words less sharp. Daniel noticed the change and wondered if it was the weight of his grandfather's words that had caused it. When she finally did call on him, her voice was steady, lacking the cruel edge it once held. Daniel answered confidently, and though she did not praise him, she did not belittle him either. For the first time, he felt treated like a student, not a target. The days that followed carried the same shift. Slowly, the cruelty faded, replaced by something more careful, more measured. Mrs. Wallace never apologized. Openly, her pride was still too strong for that, but her actions spoke louder than words. She no longer humiliated him. She no longer singled him out for ridicule. In her silence, Daniel saw the truth. She was ashamed, and that shame was its own kind of victory. It was not about revenge or humiliation in return. It was about balance being restored, about respect being demanded without violence, without anger, without bitterness. His grandfather had been right. Strength was about standing tall and letting others, us, see for themselves that they had been wrong. For Daniel, the transformation was complete. He was no longer the boy crushed under the weight of a teacher's cruelty. He was the boy who had faced it, endured it, and risen above it. His classmates no longer looked at him with laughter, but with respect. And even his teacher had been forced to change. The shame belonged to Mrs. Wallace, but the strength belonged to Daniel. And from that strength grew a new kind of courage, the kind that would carry him far beyond the walls of that classroom, because once a seed breaks through the soil, there is no turning back. It grows, it reaches, and it rises toward the sky. No matter how much darkness once tried to hold it down. The weeks that followed the helicopter's arrival became the most memorable days in the history of the small school. Students carried the memory like a treasure, retelling the story again and again to anyone who would listen. Parents heard it at dinner tables, neighbors whispered it across fences. Even people in nearby towns began to speak of the farmer's grandson whose life had turned a lesson of humiliation into a moment of triumph. For Daniel, however, the event was more than just a spectacle. It was a turning point. It was the moment when he learned that dignity was not given by others, but found within oneself. Each morning when he walked into school now, days that once mocked him no longer carried the same cruel spark. Some looked at him with respect, others with curiosity, and a few with silent admiration. The whispers in the hallway no longer stung. Instead, they reminded him that he had become something unexpected, a symbol of quiet strength. He did not boast, he did not gloat, but his presence carried weight in a way it never had before. His shoulders seemed broader, his steps firmer, his eyes clearer. The boy who once kept his head down now looked forward with calm determination. Mrs. Wallace. The teacher who had once mocked him so openly changed in subtle ways too. She never apologized outright, but her tone softened. Her sharp sarcasm disappeared, her cutting remarks quieted. When she called on Daniel, she spoke to him with the same tone she used with the others. It was a small change, perhaps unnoticed by most. But for Daniel, it was proof that even those who resist change can be touched by truth. Deep inside, he knew she carried the shame of her actions, and though she would never admit it, the memory of his grandfather standing in that doorway haunted her as much as it inspired him. At home, the family saw the difference too. Daniel's father watched him with pride as he worked on his homework each evening, his brow furrowed in focus rather than clouded by doubt. His mother smiled more often, reassured that her son was growing into someone strong enough to face the world. And his grandfather, though quiet, often studied him with a satisfied expression, as though he could already see the man Daniel would one day become. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the family sat on the porch, Daniel asked his grandfather a question that had been lingering in his mind. "Grandpa," he said softly, "why did you bring the helicopter that day? Why show everyone something you kept hidden for so long?" The old man looked out at the horizon, the fading light painting the sky in shades of red and gold. He tapped his cane against the porch floor and replied, "Because, boy, sometimes the world needs a reminder. People forget that worth is not written on clothes or titles or where you come from. Sometimes they only see what they want to see. And when they choose to look down on you, you have two choices. You can stay down, or you can rise so high that they cannot ignore you. That day, I wanted you to see that you were never meant to stay down. I wanted your teacher to see it. I wanted your classmates to see it. But most of all, I wanted you to believe it." Daniel's throat tightened with emotion. He had always admired his grandfather's wisdom, but in that moment, he understood it in a way he never had before. The helicopter was not about wealth or show. It was about dignity. It's about reclaiming what had been stripped away in that classroom. It was about planting a seed of confidence that would grow for the rest of his life, as weeks turned to months. The story of that day spread beyond the school. People began to look at Daniel differently, no longer as just the farmer's boy, but as someone destined for more. Some students who had once laughed at him now sought his friendship. Others asked him for help with lessons, realizing he was sharper than they had believed. Slowly, the image of the quiet, humiliated boy faded, replaced by one of strength, resilience, and quiet leadership. But for Daniel, the most important change was not how others saw him, what was how he saw himself. No longer did he lie awake at night replaying the teacher's cruel words. No longer did he shrink under the weight of insults. Instead, he replayed his grandfather's wisdom. He reminded himself that he was a seed, planted deep, destined to rise. And with each new day, he grew into that truth. Years later, long after the dust of that unforgettable day had settled, the story was still told. New students at the school heard whispers of the time a helicopter landed on the field, and their eyes grew wide with wonder. Teachers used the tale as a quiet reminder of the power of words, the damage they could cause, and the healing they could bring. And Daniel, though still young, carried the memory not as a tale of revenge, but as a lesson of life. He learned that humiliation does not define you. It tests you. It challenges you to decide whether you will let it bury you or push you to grow stronger. He learned that respect is not demanded through cruelty, but earned through dignity. And he learned that true power is not about making others feel small. It is about helping them see that no one is too small to rise. His grandfather's words became a compass, guiding him through every challenge. Whenever he faced doubt, he reminded himself of the seed, of the soil, of the sunlight waiting above. He carried the memory of that helicopter not as a symbol of wealth, but as proof that moments of courage can change everything. And so Daniel's story became more than a tale told in classrooms or whispered among neighbors. It became a living reminder that even in the darkest soil, seeds grow. Even in the harshest moments of humiliation, strength can be born. And even when the world looks down on you, you can rise high enough to touch the sky. That was the lasting inspiration. Not just for Daniel, but for everyone who heard his story. For every child who had been mocked, for every person who had been told they were not enough, Daniel's journey stood as proof that they too could rise. The farmer's boy who had been humiliated became the boy who showed an entire school the meaning of dignity. And in doing so, he became more than just a student. He became an inspiration, a light for others to follow. A reminder that greatness often begins in the soil where others see nothing at all. Because once a seed breaks through the ground, there is no stopping it. It grows, it stretches, and it rises, no matter how deep it was buried. And Daniel, the farmer's son, had risen.